Oh, Todd, it's absolutely lovely to see you. Now, you are in sunny California, is that right?
Yes, I am in California today. The palm trees are swaying, but it's early here, so we're up and ready to do business.
Fantastic. It is early for you. And how did you end up in California? Because people listening to the introduction and hearing your background and what you do wouldn't expect you to be there. How did you end up in California?
Well, I spent most of my life on the East Coast in New York and Washington, D.C. But I happened to marry a Californian. All of her family was in Southern California. And then my parents decided they were going to retire in California near my in laws. So by the time we had three children, I was so tired of taking the American Airlines flight from Dulles Airport in Washington, D.C. to LAX with three car seats and lots of snacks. I decided let's just move. So here we are, though I find myself in Washington, D.C. and New York very, very frequently.
Mind you, it's not a bad place to be, is it? The weather's not bad in California, is it?
It's it's pretty mild here. There's not too much wrong with San Diego where I live. And look, we've got a world famous zoo. So when Washington, D.C. becomes too animalistic and cannibalistic, I can always retreat to the San Diego Zoo for a better sort of animal life.
And maybe actually it might remind you of your life at the White House, perhaps, with that tenuous link there referring to animals. You were director of economic policy. And this is a huge question I want to ask you here, actually. What did you learn in that role, in that time?
I was very lucky at the White House because my job was to bring the president's cabinet together with the president to wrestle about economic issues. So we would essentially plan the equivalent of a dinner party. And at the cabinet table, we would have the Treasury Secretary at one end and the Commerce Secretary, the Secretary of State. Occasionally, we would bring in the chairman of the Federal Reserve Board, and they would argue about different policies in front of the president. And we would prepare the president. And so the Treasury Secretary might say, look, we need to cut taxes for people buying a new home. The Federal Reserve Board chairman said, no, I'm concerned if you do that, interest rates may go up. And then the Secretary of State might say, well, what are we going to do about oil prices? I'm concerned that Saudi Arabia is going to cut off the flow to Bahrain. And all these issues would be discussed. And then afterwards, it was my task, along with one colleague, to write the decision memo for the president, in which he would basically tick the box and say, I agree with this secretary, we're going to promote this policy. What I learned was how presidents and prime ministers make decisions. And this is the structure, the algorithm that then became part of my framework that I've then been able to share with business people, investors through my investment work, but then also through my lectures as well. If a president or prime minister makes a decision, let's say it's got something to do with cutting taxes for new home buyers, he or she has to look at that issue through various lenses. Lens number one, will it help the home building industry? Lens number two, will it change interest rates? If it makes interest rates go up, well, that may reverse some of the added oomph that you're giving to the economy. How will the financial markets accept this? Will stocks go up? Will stocks go down? How will the media portray this? Will they portray me as doing something good for middle class people, for rich people, for poor people? Will they say this has been tried before and didn't work? What is the possibility I can actually get Parliament or the Congress to pass this legislation? So by the time a president or prime minister or political leader decides on which lever to pull, he or she has had to look at that lever through various lenses and balance them out. So that taught me decision making at the highest levels. And then I've been able in my career to transfer that methodology to other kinds of work. In investment, if I'm deciding, gosh, Do I think that the British pound is going to go up or down? Do I think the French stock market will go up or down? What are the policies in place? And what is the likelihood they're going to change those policies, and in what direction? So it was fascinating to have that experience.
Do you know, that sounds really fascinating and really interesting. And I also like the comment that you made at the early on about sort of summarizing what the decisions were made. Because I can imagine in a discussion where everybody's participating and giving their piece, and you're looking at all these different lenses, is remembering what was actually the final outcome, the final decision, and having that clearly documented is vital at the time, not only for the president or a prime minister, but certainly for leaders, it's a very good thing to be doing. So that was a very important role as part of your job. That's fascinating. Is it anything like The West Wing, the program at all, or is that just total fantasy?
Well, Aaron Sorkin, who wrote The West Wing, is a brilliant writer. And what he did capture was the political dynamic and the difference of opinions as the president, in the case of the West Wing, tried to make make decisions. And so Aaron Sorkin did a great job showing what the lobbyists might be saying, what the Democrats might be saying, what the Republicans. I don't remember in the White House quite as much walking around and talking as you find in a typical Aaron Sorkin movie. So that was a little exaggerated. I found there was a little bit more sitting and a little bit more standing and less running around as people were squawking at each other. I do have to say, in addition to Aaron Sorkin and The West Wing, there is one element of Hamilton that I think was realistic, and that is in the show Hamilton. The character talks about wanting to be in the room where it happens, in the room where it happens. And that's a big part of Washington, D.C., whether at the White House or at Congress, and it's a big part of any political structure. I would get calls from very senior members of the administration who who demanded, who begged, who wheedled and inveigled to get into that room where we were structuring the debate with the president. And they would come up with all sorts of justifications. Well, if I'm not there when I testify before Congress, the president might not have as much credibility. Or how would it look if, and so in some ways I played the role, even though I was a young man at the time, I played the role of gatekeeper for some very senior people who wanted, as Alexander Hamilton said, to be in the room where it happens.
And another important lesson, how to do that graciously and effectively. That can't have been easy. So tell me, so you offered some original ideas on policy in your time, and you wrote an article, and I'm going to read it so I don't make a mistake, called Crumbling Infrastructure or Crumbling Cliche, which seems to be pretty relevant to what President Biden is doing currently. Do you think he read that article?
I wish he would read the article because it might point him in a better direction. Yeah, it's been a cliche for years in the US about how the infrastructure is crumbling. And yes, it is true. As you drive over potholes in the streets, or if you wait in a long queue at LaGuardia Airport, you may feel as if the US has not invested as much in infrastructure. But the fact is, US infrastructure has looked like it's been crumbling ever since George Washington in 1776 tried to cross the Delaware on a leaky boat. The infrastructure is always having some kind of problem. But when you actually look at the facts, the number of bridges that have structural problems has actually fallen. We've actually repaired a lot of bridges. But more important is this: what is infrastructure really? These days, during this horrible scourge called COVID, so many of us had Amazon deliver boxes and deliver groceries, not within 1 week, not within 4 days, but often within hours. People are now used to prime delivery of goods and packages and instantaneous downloads. Isn't that infrastructure? I today, Maria, could get groceries delivered to my home within a couple of hours from various grocery stores. Um, and that never would have been possible 5 or 10 or 50, in all of human history. It was not possible. It is possible now. To me, that is a symbol that some very important parts of infrastructure are in fact working extraordinarily well, beyond what anyone imagined 5 or 10 years ago. And still, we are not at the point where Jeff Bezos from Amazon has launched all the drones he's going to launch. Now, I don't mean to give Amazon too much credit, but it's just a symbol of the fact that the economy in the EU, in Britain, in the US is actually extraordinarily efficient. And so I don't think we should spend quite as much time and quite as much money pretending that our biggest infrastructure problem is a pothole in the street. And I'm afraid that's typically what's done in Washington, D.C. And on top of that, the decisions about where to spend infrastructure money are not necessarily made on the basis of where it's needed most. It's often made on the basis of where a politician can get the most publicity. And therefore, if your listeners and viewers Google bridge to nowhere, they'll find various examples in Alaska and elsewhere where there was no demand for a bridge, except for the congressman or senator who had enough power to have a ribbon cutting ceremony and announce there's no bridge. And of course, there'll be no cars except for that one opening day.
You know what? It's not just the US, I tell you. I think it's everywhere. You're learning Italian, so I'm going to give you a bit of homework here. In Italy, we say "è tutto mondo e paese," so I'll let you look that one up, and that summarizes the situation because it absolutely is the same everywhere. The other thing you did 10 years ago, I mean, there's so many interesting policy ideas that you came up with. So let me see if I'm going to touch on a couple if that's okay with you. But 10 years ago in the Wall Street Journal, you called for the government to issue 100-year bonds. What was thinking behind that?
Maria, interest rates have been virtually at the lowest in human history. When we were children, it was typical for home mortgages and banks to be lending money at maybe 5%, 6%, 7, 8, 9. And now those numbers, you need a magnifying glass when you pass by a bank in order to see what interest rate you would get on a savings account. Well, the US government, and the same is true of Britain and many governments throughout the world, have been borrowing enormous sums of money. Enormous sums. The US ratio of debt to gross domestic product is equal to where it was after World War II. It is over 100% of GDP is the amount of debt that we have racked up. And we have no idea how we will ever pay it back. And again, the numbers are similar elsewhere in the world. Here's the danger. It's not costing taxpayers very much now because interest rates are so low. The US government is borrowing money at an interest rate of maybe 1.5%. So that's a very small hit on the annual budget of the country. But what happens if interest rates go up to back to 5% or 6% or 7%, which is more normal? It will cost hundreds of billions of dollars. That's why I argued in the Wall Street Journal, as you pointed out, the US and other countries should be issuing 100-year bonds to lock in these historically low interest rates for generations to come. Instead, the average, we call it duration of debt, the average debt borrowed by the US is going to have to be rolled over or renewed in 5 years. It should be 100 years because in 5 years, if interest rates are back to normal, we're in trouble. Now, some people have said, well, Todd, who would possibly borrow or who would possibly lend to the US for 100 years? Well, it turned out Mexico has borrowed for 100 years. Some private sector companies, Disney issued what they called Sleeping Beauty bonds. A railroad, the Norfolk and Southern Railway, issued 100-year bonds. Now, Maria, are there going to be railroads in 100 years, or will we just be zooming through the air, or maybe zooming through those tubes that Elon Musk says he's going to build in the desert of Las Vegas as a test case? I don't know if there's going to be railroads, but I do know there was an appetite by the markets to buy 100-year bonds. And that's what we need to do to make sure our children and grandchildren are not crushed by the burden of the debt that we are racking up today.
That makes sense, actually, now you explain it that way. And also, I suppose in future, they may well be living to 150. Who knows? We won't be here to see it, but, all of these things
Well,
are
Maria,
possible.
I'm going to try. I'm reminded of the the Woody Allen line about someone asked Woody Allen, do you want your work to be immortal, to give you immortality? And he said, no, I don't want immortality through my work. I want to achieve immortality by not dying.
Excellent, excellent. A very wise, wise man, Woody Allen, actually. Very good. Fantastic. So here's a controversial question for you here. Before COVID, you said that the US economy had a dirty secret. The US was benefiting from the recession in the rest of the world. I mean, that's a bit of a controversial thing to say, isn't it? How is that possible?
Yes, Maria, I have to whisper when I discuss
Uh,
this dirty secret of the US economy. Shh, don't tell anyone.
yeah.
When I taught economics at Harvard and at Cambridge as well, we talked, of course, about how the world is integrated together and no man is an island in itself and so on, and all those sort of cliches. But the fact is, for about 5 years before COVID, the US economy was benefiting from the fact that most of the rest of the world was flat on its back in a recession. How's that possible? Because the rest of the world was doing so poorly, world interest rates were near zero. What that meant was that Americans who were enjoying record low unemployment, the unemployment rate in February of 2020, right before COVID, was only 3.5%. It was record low for Blacks and Hispanic Americans. There was no inflation. It was a great economy. And yet, Americans were able to borrow to buy homes and automobiles and their iPhones for 0% at a rate of 0%. That helped promote even further economic growth here in the States. If the rest of the world economy had been doing well, world interest rates would have been much higher, and Americans wouldn't have been able to afford the new homes and automobiles and iPhones that propelled the economy faster and higher. So, therefore, we actually benefited from the weak world economy that existed from 2015 until COVID hit. By the
Wow.
way, I should add, this was not a deliberate decision or policy
No.
of US administrations. This wasn't Barack Obama, Donald Trump looking around like sinister James Bond villains, figuring out how are we going to destroy the rest of the world economies. This was just a matter of circumstance, but these circumstances did create a situation that was actually very positive for the US.
Fantastic. Brilliant. So listen, let's come away a little bit from your financial investing and financial market experience. You've also invested in other things. We mentioned in the introduction, Jersey Boys as one. Are you investing in any other Broadway shows? Can you give us some insight? Give us some secrets. Tell us what's happening.
Well, that's a great question. I also was invested in kinky boots, but you'll find that many investors of all sorts, whether they're in cryptocurrency, whether they're in common stocks, or whether they're in Broadway, will generally talk about their winners. The people who go to Las Vegas and tell you about the hand that won and don't tell you that, they showed up in a $50,000 car and came back in a $100,000 Greyhound bus. So I have occasionally made some wrong decisions in that field. In fact, Aaron Sorkin lost me some money on Broadway. Of all people, the great writer Aaron Sorkin wrote a play about the invention of television called the Farnsworth invention. And one reason I invested in it was that it discussed a certain character that I wrote about in one of my books called New Ideas from Dead CEOs. So there was some overlap there. And also, the great Steven Spielberg was investing in the show. So I thought, what could go wrong? I'm side by side with Steven Spielberg. Well, it didn't work out so well. And at some point, it seemed that somehow I don't know how this happened. I and some others were actually lending money to Steven Spielberg in order to keep the show going. That's a longer story. I'm actually working on a new show now, a musical that takes place in Italy during World War II. And it's an uplifting, true story about a hero who saves children and also rides a bicycle and saves the spirit of Italy in the post-war era, which is one reason, as I mentioned, Maria, I'm trying to learn Italian so we can lend a little bit more authenticity to a show we call Glory Ride.
Fantastic. Well, listen, I'm available for consultation. If you want any help on the Italian side, you just need to feed me and give me lots of vino, and I'm very happy to help. So tell me, you mentioned actually, well, first of all, you mentioned lending money to Steven Spielberg, which not many people can say, so that's just phenomenal. But you mentioned one of your books, and you've written many, you're a prolific writer, New Ideas from Dead CEOs, which is just a strange thought there. Can you share one of your favorite stories from it?
Yes, in New Ideas from Dead CEOs, I look at great entrepreneurs of the 20th century. Estee Lauder, David Sarnoff, who created NBC and uh, uh, RCA television network, and various other entrepreneurs, and asked what are their secrets and what can we learn from them today? Well, one of the stories that not many people know is about uh, again, an Italian American immigrant named Amadeo Giannini. And here's his story, and I'll tell it to you as quickly as I can. Giannini comes to America in the late 1800s. His father works on a farm outside San Francisco. One day, the young boy, sees his father in an argument with a disgruntled farm worker. The farm worker takes a gun from his waistband and shoots the father. Well, the father dies. The kid and the mom move in to the city of San Francisco. Now, young Amadeo Giannini's a smart kid. He's a whiz at math, but he won't sit still in the classroom. Today, they'd say he's got ADD and they'd give him Ritalin or something. So what does he do? He quits school and he gets a job on the docks, with the ship workers and those who are selling vegetables and fruit. And that's his job, basically a broker of fruits and vegetables. Then he decides he wants to start a bank for the working class people of San Francisco. Now, of course, at that time, in the late 1800s, there was the JP Morgan Bank and other banks, but they wouldn't lend money to the working guys on the docks. So Giannini starts a little bank. He calls it the Banca d'Italia, the Bank of Italy. He has a little bit of success, but then 1906, the San Francisco earthquake strikes. The city is reduced to rubble, gas mains break, fires everywhere. The leading bankers of the day gather together in the last standing conference room of San Francisco, and they bang a gavel on the following resolution. They say, "We, the bankers of San Francisco, do hereby declare that we are closed for 6 months." 6 months. They say, well, the vaults are melted. By the time we get the paperwork and Amadeo Giannini, with his little Bank of Italy, steps forward and says, "You're closed 6 months?" No, he says, "I open tomorrow on a Sunday." So he rolls two wooden barrels out to the wharf, slaps a wooden plank across the top, and begins doling out credit. And he helps invigorate and restart the city of San Francisco, which 1 year after the earthquake is rebuilt more gleaming than it was before. Later, during the Great Depression in the 1930s, he buys the bonds and finances the Golden Gate Bridge. Now, the Bank of Italy, most people have not heard of. It's been gone a long time in the States. Why? Because this little Bank of Italy began to spread, and the name of it today is the Bank of America. Bank America began as a little bank on the docks serving the working class people. By the way, some of your viewers and listeners may be familiar with that great Christmas time movie, It's a Wonderful Life, with Jimmy Stewart. The Jimmy Stewart character, who plays a small town banker who saves Bedford Falls, the name of the town, that was based on Amadeo Giannini. It wasn't based on some Midwestern banker. So it's a great story. And then when I'm speaking before business audiences, I discuss how lessons of Giannini in terms of marketing and sales and so on led to his success and can be used and borrowed today by people in various realms of business practice.
I love that story. That's fantastic. I didn't know that story. It's probably one of those hidden gems. Wonderful. I love that. So we're rapidly running out of time. So I'm going to end on your latest book, which is The Price of Prosperity: Why Rich Nations Fail and How to Renew Them. Tell me how, because you've had endorsements for that book from both left and right. How did you get Republicans and Democrats to agree on anything? How did you do that?
Boy, it is tough to get people in the same room to agree on anything. In fact, some studies have shown that annual Thanksgiving Day feasts, dinners among US families have shrunken in time. People are afraid to sit down at the dining room table with their relatives for as long because at some point, Uncle Harry is going to grab a turkey wing and mouth off about something left or right. Um, we have some critical problems in mature countries, whether it's the US or Canada, Britain, France, Germany. We are all facing demographic crises and economic problems, the lapse of patriotism, the rise of some forms of perverse nationalism. It's very complicated, and there are good people on both sides. And, I've tried in my career to keep really good relationships with both sides of the aisle. So, when I've received phone calls to consult with, whether it was during the Barack Obama years, the Bill Clinton years, the George Bush years, I feel it's my patriotic duty to do so. And so I give the best advice that I can give and hope that those who call on me will take that advice. But I don't slam down the phone, curse them, and then begin tweeting out or condemning them for the decisions they ultimately make. So, in The Price of Prosperity, I look at these critical issues and I also reach back in history and say, what can we learn from Alexander the Great? What can we learn from Kemal Mustafa Ataturk from Turkey, who created the Turkish Republic? What can we learn from Golda Meir at the beginning of the founding of Israel? So I look at these various historical characters who were also in a cauldron, a boiling cauldron of disagreement and violence. And how did they come out? And how did they lead their nations out? And what lessons can we apply today? That's what The Price of Prosperity is about.
That's excellent. Listen, I could talk to you all day because there's so much. You've done so much. It's absolutely incredible. We've run out of time, but all I want to say is thank you so much. Thank you, Todd.
Thank you, Maria. It's so good to be with you.